Hello, everyone. Welcome to all of you. My name is Penny Wright. On behalf of all of us at the Rogers Memorial Library, thank you for deciding to come here today to what we know will be a really interesting talk by Raymond Dowd. Some of you come here frequently, but for those of you who aren't as familiar with us, please help yourself to our newsletters and flyers after this talk, because we'd love to have you at all of our events. So, I want to introduce today's guest, who we heard about through the library programmer's grapevine, which is comes in very handy from time to time, and it did today. So, Raymond Dowd is a partner in the law firm of Dunnington, Bartholomew and Miller, LLP, in New York City. He is also the author of Copyright Litigation Handbook. Mr. Dowd's practice consists of federal and state trial and appellate litigation, arbitration, and mediation. He served as lead trial counsel in notable cases involving art law, copyrights, trademarks, cyber squatting, privacy, trusts and decedent estates, licensing, corporate, and real estate transactions. He has litigated questions of Austrian, Canadian, French, German, Italian, Russian, and Swiss law, and handled contentious matters in surrogates court, including the case involving the recovery of an ancient Assyrian tablet for the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. Mr. Dowd lectures internationally on copyright litigation and on Nazi art looting. He's a co-founder of the annual Art Litigation and Dispute Resolution Institute at New York County Lawyers Association, and he serves on the Board of Governors of the National Arts Club. He also served as General Counsel of the Federal Bar Association. Raymond Dowd graduated cum laude from Manhattan College and received his law degree from Fordham Law School. He has a residence in West Hampton, and his interests outside of work include the restoration of the wild oyster population and sustainable aquaculture. Please welcome Raymond Dowd.
Thank you, Penny. So today's title is a little bit provocative. It's meant to make you think and offend you a little bit, and I hope it does. It's kind of like the how often do you beat your wife question. One that really doesn't have a good answer. And what I'm hoping we can do today is to take you through some history and show you a few cases and give you some of the tools to decode and decipher the news headlines that you will see in the coming months and years. Because these cases are not going away. They keep popping up, and for a while I likened them to the virgin birth story. You have a curator who popped out of a museum. Every newspaper article is the same for decades. We are shocked to find Nazi looted art in our collection, says named 30-something curator who discovered this to his or her amazement. But as you'll see, there are thousands of these stories over the years. And we have to step back and start looking at the big picture as to why do our museums have so much Nazi looted art in them. So, let's step back and follow the money. And many good mystery stories, you need to know about motive. So here we have a murder mystery. 6 million people killed. Why and how did that happen? There's still scholarly debate about the Holocaust. There's a lot of research that hasn't been done. People have a lot of theories, but let's look at the money side of it. So, at least 9% of the Nazi government budget in 1938 to 1939 was stolen from Jews. And if you look at the book, Hitler's Beneficiaries, the historian Getz Ali really explains what 9% of a government's budget is. It's an enormous percentage. It's all the employees and salaries and everything. So Getz-Ali, in his book that was published in 2006, really makes the argument that the German people do not bear the cost of the war, the social cost, that it was stolen from a minority minority of their population. Now, why is this issue so much on our radar? A lot of it is thanks to an act of District Attorney Robert Morgenthau, who in 1998 went to the MoMA and seized 2 works by the artist Egon Schiele. That made international headlines. And when D.A. Morgenthau retired, I looked at the summary of his career in the New York Law Journal and the New York Times and everything else. His seizure of these 2 artworks was not mentioned. However, I've been at worldwide conferences, diplomatic conferences with governments, and all you hear is Morgenthau, 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 because that seizure led to a great international scandal. It led to countries around the world opening up their archives, creating commissions to figure out what happened with all this artwork. And it is, I think, the most important cases in his legacy. The problem with his legacy, though, was that he lost the cases. What happened was he seized the artworks, the trial level judge quashed the subpoenas, it went up to the appellate division, they reversed and reinstated the subpoenas, then it went to the New York Court of Appeals, where the New York Court of Appeals quashed the subpoenas. So, New York City's top law dog couldn't do anything about this stolen art. Why? New York has a treaty with Austria that immunizes loans to museums from seizure by state officials, and Morgenthau was concluded to be a state official. So, the 2 works that were seized, one of them was sent back to Austria, and the other was seized by the federal government. No one can explain to me why one was seized and one wasn't. But anyway, we'll go through some of that story. Now, I want to tell you about Fritz Gruenbaum and introduce you to some of the other characters in this great drama. Fritz Gruenbaum, if you remember the Broadway show Cabaret, Joel Grey, that character, that was in part based on Fritz Gruenbaum. So he was one of the Christopher Isherwood's models for that character. He was short, he was loudly Jewish, he made jokes about his Jewishness, he made jokes about the Nazis, he was surrounded by tall, beautiful women, he had a cabaret act, he was a film star, he had shows that were performed on London and in Broadway. So he was born in Brno, Moravia, which at the time was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He died January 14, 1941 in the Dachau concentration camp. He was arrested on March 22, 1938, right after the Nazis came into Vienna. He tried to flee and was grabbed at the border, and one of the first arrestees, he never left concentration camps before he died. And his apartment was full of artworks, many of them by the artist Egon Schiele. Now, when we talk about art and we talk about tracing assets and figuring out where they came from, there's a number of artists you can think of. Let's say Picasso, for example. Picasso is very internationally known. If you see a Picasso, you don't say automatically, well, that could be Nazi-looted art. It's not like a big red flag. Egon Schiele is different. Here's why. Egon Schiele was not a success during his lifetime outside of Vienna. And within Viennese society, most of his collectors were Jews. Now, because none of his works made it outside of Austria pre-World War II, they were concentrated in ownership in a minority that was persecuted by the Nazis. So if you see a work by Egon Schiele, it's a red flag if you don't know where it comes from. So Egon Schiele died at age 28. He left behind about 3,000 artworks. An extraordinary, shocking artist. His works are shocking to us today. They've been deemed pornographic. They were banned at the time. Certain of his artworks were, he didn't allow them to be sold until 10 years after his death. So a lot of them didn't even come onto the market from his estate until like 1928. He died of Spanish influenza, which killed many people, as did his wife at the time. And this is one of the artworks that was seized by District Attorney Morgenthau, Portrait of Wally. And that was the work that the federal government seized the day after the New York Court of Appeals said that Morgenthau didn't have the power. Morgenthau tells me that he said to seize both artworks, and he doesn't know why Ray Kelly didn't do it. Ray Kelly was then the head of Homeland Security. This is the second artwork, and this was owned by Fritz Grunbaum at the time, and this was returned to Austria. So Ray Kelly tells me, Bob Morgenthau never told me to seize it. Morgenthau says Ray Kelly doesn't know what he's talking about. And journalists have tried to figure out why it is that that wasn't seized. Mary Jo White was at the time the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York. So, showed you a few characters, giving you a little background. Let's talk about what happened in the 11th hour of the Obama administration. What was the moment when every single member of Congress agreed and passed legislation? It was on December 11th, I believe, 2016, when Congress got together and Obama signed into law to provide the victims of Holocaust-era persecution and their heirs a fair opportunity to recover works of art confiscated or misappropriated by the Nazis. So think about it. In the 11th hour of the Obama administration, all of Congress, both sides of the aisle, agreed on what probably most people in this room would think is a rather obscure issue. Why? What led to that? And that's something that I want to hopefully help answer that question. So, a little bit more backgrounds in order. So here's one of those articles I mentioned. You open up the New York Times, there it is again, that Nazi-looted art story. You say, didn't I hear about that, or didn't I read about that one case? Everybody thinks there's like one case. There's hundreds of them. They're different stories. I get calls all the time. Oh, I read about your case. I'm like, no, so that's a case about a Pissarro, has nothing to do with Egon Schiele. And that's the type of story that you'll see all the time. And it always seems new and exciting, like we've never seen this before. But there's many cases pending now in U.S. courts. So we have a case now in Washington, D.C., where a group of Jewish art dealers had a collection of Christian artifacts. Now, when I use the word Jewish, it's a term that changed in meaning over history. So when the Nuremberg laws were passed in 1935, someone who thought of themselves as a Christian art dealer might have been deemed to be a Jewish art dealer. So just by reading that, well, it was Jewish art dealers that owned it, you still don't know the story. Was that a family that generations earlier had converted to Christianity? Why is it that Jews had all this Christian iconography in their homes? Well, a lot of them did not consider themselves Jewish. We see on the internet advocacy for returning Nazi-looted artwork. So here's a Twitter account, return the Pissarro. This is the social media equivalent of advocacy that's going on, that if you go on Twitter and social media, you can find these things. And here we have a case that was brought in New York that's transferred to Oklahoma. Now, one doesn't think of Oklahoma as a center for Nazi-looted art, but the Oklahoma legislature passed a resolution directing the University of Oklahoma to return this Pissarro. Now, Oklahoma is the reddest state in the union. All of the legislature are Republicans, so it's not some sort of New York Democratic liberal thing. This is happening in the heartland of America. And it's also a worldwide thing. So I've given you, in the materials that are available through Penny Wright and the library, you can get them out electronically by link, there are materials that show there's a worldwide issue here. And so if you think about it, what are the countries who are doing the right thing? What are the countries that are not doing the right thing? So after World War II, we had a division of Europe. And the Eastern European side, the Stalin's troops came in and cleaned out everything. They took everything. They said 40 million of our soldiers died in this war. We're taking back everything that we can. So great wealth, cultural wealth, was concentrated in Moscow, where a lot of it remains today. So the Germans are still hopeful that they will get cultural treasures back from Russia, and they're still negotiating for that. Now, at the same time that things belonging to Germany were taken by the Russians, things that belonged to Jews that had been stolen by Germans were swept up in that. So that shows you some of the levels of complexity of figuring out where these things are and how to unwind the problem. And there are countries like Romania, Poland, others that have done very little and have cut off all rights of Jews to have any effective remedy in getting things back through their legal system. So here's an overview that was produced by the Jewish Claims Conference. And really the big players that agreed following the Morgenthau scandal to do something, to set up claims conferences or tribunals or commissions to assist victims. The two countries who really didn't do the right thing were Russia and the United States. So I want to focus on the United States. So we have this act of Congress in the late part of the Obama administration that I would say is doing the right thing. And why is it that doing the right thing involving private property in the context of a war is such an American thing? Well, you think about the soldiers during World War II that shed a lot of blood. A lot of it was fighting against the wrongs that had been done to the Jewish population, including property crimes. So the Nuremberg trials, when the prosecutor got up there, he was going to go first through the property crimes and then deal with the murders. But the media and the judges were so against him that he had to stop, and he started rolling the films that showed the concentration camp footage, because the world was not believing what happened. The judge is sitting there, the press was mocking him, and he felt that he would lose. So the entire portion of the Nuremberg trial materials that deal with property crimes never got adjudicated. It got swept under the rug with the Cold War. So again, back to why is this an American thing? Well, Abraham Lincoln had an idea in the context of the U.S. Civil War, which was that we shouldn't have wars for profit anymore. And he asked a man named Bernard Lieber to write down what the law of war ought to be. And he was the first one to do that, according to sources that I've read. And he came up with something called the Lieber Code. And it had to do with regulations on what the Army could and couldn't use, could and couldn't take. It exempted from seizure cultural property, hospitals, private property of all sorts. And in that, of course, was artworks. And that Lieber Code became Executive Order 100, and it was in force for our military until the early 20th century, and it's been modified since. But that code was then adopted into international law by the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907. So Germany was a signatory to those conventions. And that's the legal reason for Nuremberg. That's the legal basis for a trial, that this was a crime against international law that Germany had signed on to. That was the law that the Nazis broke. It was Abraham Lincoln's conception that had been embraced by the civilized world that wanted to end the murderous, profit-driven wars that roiled Europe for centuries. So, how did I get involved in all of this? My background is Irish Catholic. I'm a graduate of West Hampton Beach High School. I was born in Brooklyn. I don't speak German. So how did I end up with all of this? And why am I so worked up about it? Well, this headless woman entered my life in 2005. And this is a work by Egon Schiele, known as Seated Woman with Bent Left Leg. Torso. Now, one of the interesting things about Egon Schiele as an artist is he never wrote titles on his works. So some artists do and some artists don't. So what that means is that any art dealer who wants to enhance the value of an artwork can give it a nicer name, which means it becomes incredibly difficult to track and to tell. And that becomes part of the mystery that we're going to walk through. But this headless woman entered my life because a man named Leon Fisher came to my office. He said, I got sued. Can you handle it? And I said, well, I've done a lot of federal litigation. This is about one artwork. How hard could that be? I read the complaint. And basically engaged in 12 years of litigation. Okay, I thought this was a slam dunk. I read the complaint, I'm like, how can I lose this case? And I'll explain how I lost it. So what happened was, they had put up, Sotheby's had put up this work for sale for auction in New York. It was withdrawn from auction. Then it was, they held an auction in London. Now, before the auction in London went off, the IKG, the Jewish community in Vienna, wrote to Sotheby's saying that work belonged to Fritz Grunbaum. Don't auction it. And my client was an heir of Fritz Grunbaum. I had no idea that this woman from the Jewish community was writing letters to Sotheby's. My client then was told by an Austrian lawyer, that's a Grunbaum work, you have to claim it. So he says, okay. The lawyer in Austria writes a letter to Sotheby's in London, but the letter arrives after it's in the auction catalog, it's going up for auction. And so the successful bidder at auction learns of my client's claim. The consignor is a Massachusetts resident, so he sues my client in New York County for this botched auction in London. Now, when I tell law professors about this, that's the greatest hypothetical, because what law applies, who did what. So anyway, I got to defend this case, and I said, well, I think we ought to counterclaim to try to get this in other works back. So that's what we spent many, many years litigating. So I learned during that point, I mean, you see the movies, And there's lots of sounds of jackboots, and then there's guns, and then there's banging on the door, and then Jews are thrown out. And that's how I thought Jews lost their property. That's not really at all how it happened. It happened in a very nonviolent manner. For the most part, there was terror. But most of the property takings were these semi-seeming voluntary transactions. And I'll go through just to take you through some of the background. As of April, well, the Nazi Party platform says it is a crime, you are a traitor to the German people, to buy or sell from a Jew. Then, when Hitler gets to power, they institute an immediate and total boycott of Jews. So there are parts of Germany where Jews can't even buy food or medicine as of April 1933. So, in looking back in time, all of the actions have to be understood in that context. And this was no secret. This was on the front pages of the New York Times. I went back and I read the front page articles. It's in the New York Times. So to think that you didn't know, or this community in New York didn't know, or people in the museums of New York didn't know what was happening to people whose property was being taken is just completely outrageous. Now, how it happened was prior to Hitler coming to power, there was a group called, they imposed during the Weimar Republic what's called a right flight tax. If you wanted to leave Germany and go to Pennsylvania and buy a farm, you took your assets, you put them essentially in trust. The German government would take a 25% and would remit the proceeds to you, and you could go settle in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. When the Nazis came to power, that mechanism was used for spoliation of Jews. It was used in a very anti-Semitic way. So what they did is when you were Jewish and you wanted to leave the country, they imposed a confiscatory foreign exchange rate. They paid the money into blocked bank accounts. They made up something called Sperrmarks, which were marks that could only be used by Jews but really couldn't be used. So they had all of these sham transactions that seemed like paperwork. So Jewish people, they had a law called the Property Declaration Law of April 1938, for example. So that required you to declare your assets every quarter and until the assets were gone or you left the Reich. So those assets were systematically liquidated. In addition, there was an atonement tax, and during this period, let's say 1933 to 1945, tens of thousands of artworks left the Reich and were snapped up by U.S. museums and wealthy collectors. Now, how do we know that the Nazis thought that they were taking all of Jewish property? Well, they made lists and they documented it. So here, for example, is a 1938 Nazi finance ministry decree on Jewish property, and they go through and they tally up. This is the property of all the Jews, and this is how we liquidated it to finance the war effort. Now, the only way I found this document was from a footnote from Getz Ali's book. I couldn't find this in any other scholarship. And when you read all the scholarship of the final solution, the property part is really left out. And if you're studying a murder and you're eliminating a financial motive from the story, it really makes it much harder to understand. So I think this property theft motive is very important in telling the story of the Holocaust. And I've gone to synagogues and appeared before Jewish organizations, and I say, how many people have ever seen a Jewish property declaration? Maybe one person in a whole audience, and it's really somebody who's an expert historian. So that's what a property declaration looks like. You had to declare it, you had to attach all your property, like an IRS, and only Jews were the ones who had to file them. And Jewish property was liquidated in a number of ways. When they first started out, they had what was called wild Aryanization. That is, I'm an Aryan, you're a Jew, I'm stealing your house. Well, the Nazis figured out pretty quickly that that didn't finance the war, the effort, it didn't finance the Nazi party, it just made a few cronies rich. Hitler wanted to collect all of that money for himself, his party, and to build a movement. So they started with, they had seizures, they had confiscations. So confiscation would be a judge decreeing, yes, I find that this is a Jew, this is the Jew's property, and I issue a court order. That's a formal confiscation. Other property was liquidated through Aryan trustees. So an Aryan would be appointed as the property guardian for Jews and would liquidate the property just like a guardian would here. And so depending on what time in history and what country you were in, Adolf Eichmann was the architect of what they call the Vienna model of spoliation. He bragged that he put a Jew with all their property on one end of a conveyor belt, and on the other end they'd have a passport and just enough money to leave the country. So he bragged that he had figured out how to export Jews profitably. Then they found that a lot of the Jews couldn't even leave the country, even with the documents, because they wouldn't be accepted anywhere. So they had a problem of Jews that they had to feed and maintain, and that is the basis for the final solution. That was the problem that gave rise to the solution. So here in the trial, we took the various Jewish property declarations filed by Fritz Grünbaum and his wife, and you can see that certain things are liquidated quickly. The art collection is the candy stripe, and so we were able to trace his art collection up to June of 1939 that had been declared in his declaration. And here's the attachment to Fritz's property declaration. We see on the left, there's 5 artworks by the artist Egon Schiele, and they're oils that are named by title. Those are relatively easy to trace because there was a catalog raisonné of Egon Schiele's works, oils, done early on. But the circled area is 76 color drawings. Now, to get an idea of the value of that, people said, well, that could be $100 million worth of drawings, because Schiele was really prized for his drawings, and they have really high prices. So the man's name, who has the stamp on this inventory, and this is weeks after the Anschluss, is Franz Kiesinger, and he became, in the Nazi looting hierarchy, assistant to Kajetan Mühlmann, who's been called by one expert arguably the single most prodigious art plunderer in the history of human civilization. And we found this inventory that Fritz's artworks had been inventoried at one point, and you see the swastika stamps on them. Also, in understanding how Jewish property was sold for fine art, the Dorotheum in Vienna was used as a clearinghouse for the better class of artworks, and the Dorotheum today is considered, the Sotheby's or Christie's of Austria, and it no longer has swastikas on the covers of its artworks. There were private sales, and here I want to draw your attention to a notice that I found, and I asked scholars about this notice, and nobody knew what it was or what it meant. So it's a notice to English or American purchasers, and you see it's in English, for a sale that was happening in Berlin in 1938. And it says you can get a 30% discount if you pay through the Fides Treuhand of Switzerland. Fides Treuhand exists today. It was founded in 1910. It's a subsidiary of Credit Suisse. They've never told us what money ever passed through or what Americans or British were buying. This has never been researched. It's never been revealed. So a lot of this story has still not been told. As the U.S. Consul General in Vienna said, there's a curious respect for legal formalities. The signature of the person despoiled is always obtained, even if the person in question has to be sent to Dachau in order to break down his resistance. And indeed, this is the power of attorney that Fritz Grünbaum signed at Dachau, authorizing his wife to liquidate his property. Remember, to do all the work of selling all that property, it's a pain. You have to get somebody to do it. Who is going to liquidate the life insurance policy? Who's going to sell off everything? So he gives a power of attorney. That permits his wife to do it. The Nazis made sure once the life insurance policies were liquidated, that's when she was shipped off to the death camp. They extracted every single bit that they could out of these people before they murdered them. So here's a cheerful letter that Mrs. Grünbaum, while her husband is in Dachau, receives. Dear Mrs. Grünbaum, the Department of Foreign Exchange appointed me to deal with the whole property of the Grünbaums. That's her and her husband. You asked me what you owe me and Dr. Bayer. So the lawyer wants basically twice the salary of a worker for a year as his bill, as he introduces himself to his client. So the legal profession, accountants, bankers, this is how Jewish property was systematically liquidated. And I've got a translation of the power of attorney in there, in the materials. And so one judge concluded that Grünbaum was arrested while attempting to flee from the Nazis. After his arrest, he never again had physical possession of any of his artwork, including the drawing, that's the headless woman. The power of attorney, which he was forced to execute while in the Dachau concentration camp, divested him of his legal control over the drawing. Such an involuntary divestiture of possession and legal control rendered any subsequent transfer void. So, I want to get to the punchline on this case. Why did I lose this case? Well, after the judge for the Second Circuit said Grünbaum lost everything, that thing was stolen, we've got all the evidence, we showed all the evidence, the judge said, you know what? Leon Fisher, the man who walked in my office, his family could have done something to put this poor Massachusetts owner on notice previously. Now, he doesn't say what they could have done. And it's not the rule for anybody else in our society. So if your grandfather's car is stolen and you find it tomorrow, it's yours. I mean, the rule here is that if there's a thief in the chain of title, no one takes good title. But in this case, they seem to have carved out an exception for Jews, which is why court after court around the country made similar rulings, that Jews were out of time, out of luck, lazy, could have done more, and they used what's called the doctrine of latches to dispossess. They used the statute of limitations to say, well, the clock started ticking, and you should have really known what was on the walls of the museum in Toledo or any of these other places. And so that's why Congress had to pass that law at the end of the Obama administration. Now, I want to just take you through a few examples of, well, let me back up and let's ask the question of why this all happened. Why did these artworks end up in the U.S. Museum? Well, J.P. Morgan, back in 1909, said, I'm not bringing all my artwork to the United States, so I have to pay a tax. So the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act exempted works that were over 20 years old from U.S. duties. So that paved the way for the great collecting spree of the 20th century. But really what heated things up was this man. Andrew Mellon got a bill from the Roosevelt administration saying, you owe us a lot of income tax. Income tax was a new thing at the time. He said, oh, no. I made donations to the National Gallery. I should be able to deduct the fair market value of those donations. Doesn't matter what I paid. The response was, that's crazy. Back and forth. Mellon won. Roosevelt lost. that provision, that loophole is today in our Internal Revenue Code, which means that wealthy donors, no matter what they donate, can deduct what they call the fair market value. Now, we know from the days of Michael Milken and people like that, who were caught up in scandals involving museums after all that Drexel stuff, that if you're going to be a good capitalist and buy low, sell high, you can be even more clever, buy stolen, which is cheaper, and then donate. Why? Because donations actually give you more yield if you're wealthy from shielding your income than a sale would, because you don't have to pay capital gains tax. So donating became a planning, a very legitimate planning exercise to shield your wealth from taxation. But for the unscrupulous, it opened up the door to start moving stolen objects into museums. Now, if you're getting people to accept stolen art in exchange for you having tax exchange, that can get a little bureaucratic. So you need friends on the boards of trustees. Even better, if you have your own museum, there's even less scrutiny. So that opened up a whole wave of American museums. Today, there are more museums in the U.S. than there are Starbucks and McDonald's combined. So, you step back and think about this in the big picture sense. Why does everybody need his or her museum? And there are very legitimate reasons, and there are some reasons that seem unfair to many of us. The great American narratives that the monuments men came in, they took all the art, they saved all of Europe's art, it all went back, but it really didn't play out that way. They saved a lot, they were good men and fought World War II, and they preserved a lot, but most of them were museum directors or working in museums before they left. And when they came back, they started competing with each other to get what? The greatest collections of European art and other art that they possibly could. And so when they're competing with each other, they didn't look too closely at where things came from. And so Hollywood's Monuments Men has morphed into Woman in Gold, which tells a well-done performance by Helen Mirren, really giving you a lot of the nuances and the difficulties and the emotional difficulties that go into reclaiming these artworks, to facing that history, to going back to that dark period. It's an excellent film. I recommend it. And if you go to the Neue Gallery in New York, you can see that great artwork that was her Aunt Adele. As a shameless plug for my prowess, I recovered that amulet for the Pergamon Museum in New York. And the case was particularly interesting because I was representing Germany, and the reason I was representing Germany was they'd gotten a really bad ruling at the trial level. And I called up the lawyers and I said, you've got to get that reversed. I have all these Jewish clients. If that case stands, we're out of luck. You have to appeal it. They said, can you come over here? And they hired me. And so I helped their legal team do the appeals. And then the 92-year-old lawyer who successfully argued the second level appeal, and I quarterbacked for him, he died 2 weeks after winning. And then I went up to the Court of Appeals and argued the successful return of that. Notable was that amulet appeared in the safe deposit box of a Jewish man in Nassau County who was an Auschwitz survivor. Even more notable was at the Court of Appeals level, I had amicus briefs, that is friends of the court, from Holocaust survivor groups saying Germany has to get this back, because if the rule changes to finders keepers and too late you're out, we will never recover our cultural heritage. So we had the Jewish groups supporting the Pergamon Museum in that. So it was very fraught, and it was a very interesting experience. And just to put an underline, an underscore on everybody knew this stuff at the time, here's State Department bulletins. This one was 1943, and we said, we know all of these sham transactions are going on. We know that the Dutch are doing it. We know that the Swiss are doing it. We know that they're laundering property and the Nazis are playing games with property. And it is our policy, and the policy of all the allies. We will undo all of those transactions. And this declaration, the London Declaration of 1943, has been reaffirmed and reaffirmed and reaffirmed by our State Department. And in Congress's 11th hour, they reaffirmed it again, that this is our victory of World War II. This is our policy. We will continue. Again, when you're facing the museums and auction houses, and they're going, how could we know? Front page of the New York Times. Europe is still hunting its plundered art. And on page A1, article by Milton Estro, who's still out there fighting a good fight, between 1945 and 1962, 3,978 stolen art objects were recovered in this country by the State Department with the assistance of other government agencies and returned to 14 nations overseas. So our government was knocking on doors. They were putting out bulletins to universities, museums, libraries, art dealers, and booksellers, saying, this stuff is missing, help us find it. So when you see the museum establishment today going, how could we possibly have known these things? This is a little context to say, did you sleep through the war? Where were you at this point? And we're talking people in museums at the highest caliber of our society. They're the most educated folks. They're the people that really should know better. And during the whole time, transporting the stolen property is a crime. So there's the federal law, National Stolen Property Act. Every state has equivalent laws. It's a crime to conceal stolen property. So, they basically, they say, well, it's in plain sight. But if you go to a museum and it says gifted of Mr. and Mrs. Rockefeller or Pulitzer or something, it doesn't give you enough information to say where it came from or help you and your family trace it. So displaying these objects in plain sight is not enough to lead to education about where it came from. So we all assume that museums are educating our populace and that they're looking closely at the provenance and where things came from, that should be interested in the people who collected. But for the most part, they're really not. It's not really taught so much in art schools. Provenance now is because they keep saying it's going to become fashionable, but I'm not sure that that's really an academic discipline that's getting much attention. So just a few examples here. Again, an example of Christian iconography where this work, Christ carrying the cross, is returned to a Jewish family after being seized by prosecutors in Florida in 2012. If we look at the museums, after the Morgenthau scandal, there was what was called the Washington Conference. All the museums said, oh, we'll track down all this Nazi looted art and we'll catalog it. So they all started these provenance projects that seemed to peter out in about 2000, after they said they were doing it. But you can go and visit the websites and say the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and you will find their provenance research project. You'll see 409 objects, and they will give you some information about them. And these provenance research projects should cover works that entered this country after 1932, but were created prior to 1946, and had some sort of European provenance. So it doesn't mean they're looted necessarily, But gaps in those provenances are red flags that allow scholars and others to track these things down. If you think about the immense cost of where artwork has gone all over the world in different countries and trying to track and cross-match, it takes years and very confusing. Here's the Met's project, 769 records, and unfortunately they limited their efforts to only like paintings. So fine art, multiple sculptures, they just said, well, you know, there's multiple ones, it's too hard to do, we're giving up. So you think about the social value, we give out unlimited tax breaks to institutions that essentially throw things in an Indiana Jones-like cave. The Met is only ever going to show us maybe 2% of its holdings ever that the public will even see. And we don't know what the rest is. So us giving unlimited tax breaks for stuff that we don't know and can't track is not necessarily the highest social good. So I'm giving you some examples in there. And just this is from the Detroit Institute of the Arts. So it's not from some liberal New York attorney with an axe to grind. Here's what they say. It has subsequently been estimated that approximately 20% of Nazi-era looted art remained in private hands and continued to circulate on the market, with much of it finding its way into U.S. art museums. Okay, that's bureaucrat speak from the Detroit Institute of the Arts, one of the most conservative institutions in the nation. Detroit doesn't want to lose its art museum. It doesn't want to lose any of its art, and it is admitting that this extraordinary trove of Nazi-looted art is still in our nation's museums today. So I have lots more examples, but I've got to limit my time. So I'd like to open it up for questions and answers. Yes?
Just a minor question. When Ryan wrote about the analog power at auction, was the Maria Alton case in process?
No. The question is, when Ronald Lauder got that Adele Bauer painting, was the case still in process? He got it back because Maria won an arbitration. After it went to the U.S. Supreme Court, the parties agreed that they would submit to an Austrian arbitration. So the case wasn't going on. The arbitration resolved that question favorably to Maria Alton. And I believe it sold for $135 million, and Randy Schoenberg did very well on that.
I have a microphone here just to help us hear a little bit,
Great.
if you don't mind.
You mentioned that there are so many museums in this country. Are they private? So in other words, does the public even have access to them? And how is the law of that you can just create a museum but then close the doors?
Well, I think it's, there are, in any institution, any good institution that you have, there's going to be abuses. So there are great colleges, and then there are sham colleges. I think we might agree that some of these museums, when it's in your backyard and you limit the hours to, every third Tuesday when the lunar eclipse is, there's a lot of that. So the IRS has guidelines, they'll disallow things. I think it changes. There was a recent New York Times article about private museums and people doing things that were, at least from the New York Times' view, judged to be abusive. Very few museums potentially have Nazi-looted art. I mean, I think there's maybe 122 that have the type of collections that would have this type of artwork. That slide was just to sort of demonstrate, and everybody finds it one of the most shocking slides, to demonstrate that this is something that's not so elite that it's not worthy of study. It's an economically important thing that we ought to think a lot about the tax fairness. I mean, duck decoys, piles of garbage, everything is in these museums. And at a certain point, how much are we going to soak the taxpayer for it? Shouldn't be a question. It's not. I'm a big fan of museums. I'm a great fan of culture and the arts and promoting arts and artists and the development of fine arts. So please don't read anything into my presentation that I'm against museums, but I am against abuses of museums. Yes.
The dealers during the war in Europe, many of them were Jewish. They helped fudge the provenance of many of these artworks. Obviously, Wallenstein, I think, was one of them. There were many. Switzerland, governments were involved, Nazis were involved. It was cash. And they were, I think Hector Feliciano in his Lost Museum and Lynn Nichols in The Rape of Europa clearly talked about these things. But it's amazing and it's ironic that American museums talk about the rest of the world. The Elgin marbles that the Brits have that belongs elsewhere. And, you know, we criticize, the museums have criticized everybody else. But has anybody had the audacity to criticize the American museums to the extent that you point out they deserve to be criticized?
Well, thank you for the question. I think when I started out talking about Nazi-looted art, I could see people look at me like I had a tinfoil hat on, talking about something crazy, and I said, no, this is really a big deal. And, you know, what I said, there was not even conspiracy theorists on the internet who were willing to say some of these things about museums. I think the atmosphere is changing. I think a film like Woman in Gold has really brought it to the fore. Again, with my Catholic background, being so amazed to see written about my clients the anti-Semitic tropes of them being greedy Jews. Oh, when the artwork becomes valuable, the Jews come out. The Austrians say this, and this type of stuff is republished uncritically by the New York Times. And it's outrageous.
Sorry, is it mine?
I've never, I mean, I've represented a lot of people over time, and only in representing Jews have I encountered that kind of stuff. And, you know, I met with the head of Art News, and they're like, oh, you're going to make money if you win. I'm like, yeah, well, so what? I'm like, you think these cases are easy? I do much better chasing ambulances. So if you're going to look down on me for wanting to make a living, or you're going to look down on Randy Schoenberg because he gave up decades of his life to chase this thing with absolutely no guarantee of success, and you know, the sarcasm that I was faced. And this is Art News. Jewish people looking at me sarcastically about wanting to cash in. And there's so many easier ways of making money in New York City, let me tell you.
Sure. We applaud you for this.
Oh, thank you. Yes?
I was very interested in that movie, Woman in Gold. And it seems with the machinations of the legal stuff, that they were able to bring it to the United States and have it tried here was not for the picture or anything. It was for the fact, and this isn't a movie, so I don't know if it's right or wrong, the fact that they published a catalog, and they sold the catalog, and that made it American business.
Yes, yeah, that's a very good point. And the movie is really good on the law. Now, my expert says he was the expert that figured that stuff out in Vienna, and if anybody thinks that Maria Altman went through those archives, they're crazy. But that, you know, there's a little bit of Hollywood in the film. But the whole thing about the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act and why it is that Austria was able to be sued in a California court was quite accurate. So what Austria does is engages in commerce. So if you open up any Austrian tourism guide, there's going to be pictures of Avon Sheila. in there. I mean, it's Klimt, Sheila, and Kokoschka that are the three Austrian artists that you might ever have heard of. And the Austrians are quite proud of those artists.
Okay, well, maybe we'll end on this note. And Ray, thank you so much. This was a very interesting talk.